To billionaire industrialist Richard Vance, his wife Ella was a plain, embarrassing secret fit for his penthouse, but not for the public eye. He banned her from his company's biggest night, the glittering annual Gala, telling her she was simply too plain to be on his arm. But Ella had a secret of her own. While Richard was basking in the glow of camera flashes, she wasn't at home weeping. She was making an entrance that would not only upend his night, but shatter the very foundations of his empire. Richard Vance considered himself a sculptor of empires, a modern-day Medici. His canvas was the steel and glass of New York City, and his medium was money oceans of it. The Vance Industries logo, a stylized V that resembled a soaring eagle, was branded onto everything, from cutting-edge aerospace technology to the philanthropic foundations that washed the city's elite in a glow of self-congratulation. And tonight was the holiest of holies, the annual Vance Industries Gala, a night Richard orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign and the flair of a Broadway producer. It was a night for power, for seeing and being seen, for reinforcing the myth of Richard Vance. And it was a night his wife Ella was expressly forbidden from attending. Absolutely not. He'd said the words, clipping the air in their cavernous penthouse overlooking Central Park. The setting sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of apricot and lavender, but inside, the atmosphere was glacial. Richard stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror, adjusting the cuffs of his custom Tom Ford tuxedo. He wasn't looking at his reflection. He was admiring the portrait of a king. Ella flinched, but years of practice had taught her how to absorb the blows without showing the bruises. "Richard, please. It's the 10th anniversary. It would mean a lot to me to be there." She kept her voice low, a soft, placid thing he so often ignored. She was dressed in a simple grey cashmere sweater and slacks, her dark hair pulled back in a neat but unremarkable ponytail. Her face, devoid of makeup, was pleasant, with kind, intelligent eyes, but in Richard's world of cosmetic perfection and surgical enhancements, her naturalism was a liability. She was in his cruelest private thoughts, aggressively plain. "What it means to you is irrelevant," he said, turning to face her. His eyes, the color of polished slate, swept over her with a familiar expression of faint disgust. "This is not a high school dance, Ella. It's business. It's about image perception. The board will be there. International investors Sheikh Al Fahim is flying in from Dubai. I need to project strength, success, flawlessness." The final word hung in the air between them, a poisoned dart aimed directly at her heart. She was the flaw. "I bought a dress," she offered, a desperate last attempt. "It's modest, elegant, a navy blue Carolina Herrera." Richard actually laughed, a short, humorless bark. "Darling, you could be wearing a gown woven from moonbeams, and you'd still be you. You don't have the sparkle, the ambition. You walk into a room and you disappear. I need a supernova on my arm, not a shadow." He walked over to the marble-topped bar and poured himself a glass of Macallan 25. The amber liquid swirled as he moved, a miniature storm in a crystal glass. He had met Ella 10 years ago. He was a rising star then, hungry and ruthless, with a chip on his shoulder the size of Manhattan. She was a librarian at a private university, quiet, well-read, with a serenity that had, for a brief, bewildering time, soothed the raging fire in his gut. He'd seen her as a refuge, a peaceful harbor from his cutthroat world. But harbors were for docking, not for display. As his wealth and status skyrocketed, his perception of her shifted. His peaceful refuge became his gilded cage, and she, the unassuming warden. She didn't fit in with the glossy, pouting wives of his peers, women who spoke of charity auctions and Pilates in the same breath, their faces pulled taut, their bodies honed into weapons of social warfare. Ella read classic literature. She volunteered at a soup kitchen in the Bronx, a fact he'd strictly forbidden her from ever mentioning. She was real, in a world that celebrated artifice, and it embarrassed him to his core. "I'm sorry, Richard," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The fight had gone out of her. "I just thought—" Don't think he snapped downing the scotch in one smooth motion. "That's my job. Your job is to manage the house, ensure my life runs smoothly, be my quiet place. And tonight, my quiet place is here, at home. Understood?" She nodded, her eyes fixed on the intricate patterns of the Persian rug beneath her feet. It was worth more than the house she grew up in. Every object in the penthouse was a testament to his success and her irrelevance. The contemporary art on the walls, chosen by a consultant, was bold and aggressive. The furniture, minimalist and severe, offered no comfort. It was a museum of a life, not a home. "Good," he said, his tone softening almost imperceptibly now that he had won. He walked over and placed a cool hand on her cheek. It was a gesture that was meant to be placating, but it felt like an assertion of ownership. "I'll have a car sent for you tomorrow. We'll go to Perse for lunch. Just us, a consolation prize, a scrap from the king's table." She nodded again, unable to speak, past the lump forming in her throat. He smiled, satisfied, and turned to leave. At the door, his assistant, a sharp-edged woman named Clarissa, with a law degree and predatory eyes, was waiting with his briefcase. She gave Ella a look that was a perfect cocktail of pity and contempt before turning her adoring gaze back to Richard. "The car is downstairs, Mr. Vance. Traffic is clear. You'll be at the Met in 20 minutes, Clarissa purred. "Excellent. Let's go." The heavy door clicked shut, leaving Ella alone in the suffocating silence of the penthouse. For a long moment, she didn't move. The city lights began to glitter outside, a sprawling galaxy of dreams and ambitions that felt a million miles away. She was a ghost in her own life, a silent partner in a marriage that was nothing more than a business transaction where her stock had plummeted to zero. He called her plain, a shadow, the flaw in his perfect life. She walked slowly to their bedroom, the insult coiling in her stomach like a cold snake. She slid open the door to her walk-in closet, a space Richard had designed. It was filled with tasteful, expensive, and deeply boring clothes he and his stylists had approved. Beige, navy gray, the colors of invisibility. Tucked away at the very back, in an opaque garment bag, was the Carolina Herrera gown. She unzipped it, the silk rustling softly. It was beautiful, a deep midnight blue with a classic cut that was both elegant and understated. It was a dress for a woman of substance, not of sparkle. She held it up to her body, looking at her faint reflection in the closet's polished mahogany. And for the first time in a long time, the placid surface of her demeanor began to crack. A tremor of something hot and unfamiliar ran through her. It wasn't just anger, it was rage. A slow-burning, deep-seated rage that had been simmering for a decade. He thought she was a shadow. He was about to learn that shadows are only cast when there is a powerful, blinding light. She let the dress fall to the floor. She walked over to her nightstand and picked up her simple, unadorned cell phone, a stark contrast to Richard's latest satellite-enabled gadget. She scrolled through her contacts past the caterers, the house manager, and the drivers to a name Richard had never seen, a name he didn't even know existed. The name was Julian. She pressed the call button. It rang twice before a man's voice, calm and cultured, with a hint of a British accent, answered. "Ella, I was wondering when you'd call." A single tear, hot and defiant, traced a path down her cheek. "Julian," she said, her voice no longer a whisper, but a low, steady flame. "The gala. It's tonight." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, "I assume you are not calling to wish me a pleasant evening from the sidelines." "No," she said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "I'm calling in the cavalry. Operation Starfall is a go." "Excellent," the voice replied, a note of satisfaction in his tone. "The board is already assembling. Your chariot awaits. Just tell me, Ella, what shall you wear?" She looked at her reflection again, but this time she saw past the plain facade. She saw the strength she had kept hidden, the intelligence she had downplayed, the power she had never used. "Oh, I think it's time to stop disappearing," she said, her voice ringing with newfound clarity in the empty, opulent room. "Tonight, I'm not wearing a shadow. I'm wearing a statement." Julian Rowe was not a man who dealt in half measures. His world was one of precision strategy and absolute discretion. Officially, he was a highly sought-after risk consultant for global corporations, a man who made problems disappear with the quiet efficiency of a master watchmaker. Unofficially, he was the keeper of secrets for some of the world's most powerful families. And for the past 10 years, he had been Ella's sworn protector, a promise made to her late father, the formidable titan of old-world industry, Augustus Sterling. When Augustus passed away, he had left his only daughter not just an immense, almost incomprehensibly large fortune, but also a network of fiercely loyal allies with Julian as its chief architect. Augustus had been wary of Richard Vance from the start, sensing the man's rapacious ambition and the hollowness of his character. He'd consented to the marriage only because Ella, weary of the gilded cage of her own inheritance, had craved a life of perceived normalcy. She wanted to be loved for herself, not for the Sterling name. Augustus, in his wisdom, allowed it, but not without putting contingencies in place. Julian was the ultimate contingency. "The car is 5 minutes out," Julian said, his voice crisp through the phone. "It's a black Mercedes Maybach, not one of Richard's ostentatious Rolls-Royces. The driver's name is Arthur. He's one of ours. He will take you to the prearranged location." "The Carlisle," Ella asked, her mind already racing, shifting gears from a decade of passive acceptance to active command. "Precisely, the Sterling suite. It has been maintained for you as per your father's instructions. Everything you need is waiting." Ella took a deep breath. The Carlisle Hotel was a bastion of old New York elegance, a place so steeped in history and power that it made Richard's ultra-modern penthouse feel like a cheap imitation. Her father had kept a permanent residence there, a sprawling multi-room suite that was more of a command center than a hotel room. She hadn't set foot in it since his death. The board members she queried, slipping on a simple pair of loafers and grabbing a plain, black trench coat from her closet. Mr. Chen from Shanghai, Ms. Dubois from Paris, and Lord Harrington from London have been activated. They are currently enjoying a quiet, pre-gala cocktail in the suite's library. They are very much looking forward to seeing you, Ella, or perhaps I should say Ms. Sterling. The name sent a jolt through her. She hadn't been Ms. Sterling in a decade. She had buried that identity, hoping to find happiness as Mrs. Vance. Now she realized she hadn't buried it. She had merely kept it in reserve. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, she said, her voice firm. She walked out of the bedroom, past the discarded Herrera gown. a relic of a life she was shedding with every step. She moved through the silent penthouse, her footsteps echoing faintly on the polished marble floors. She didn't look back. There was nothing to look back at. The ride downtown was a blur of neon and motion. Ella stared out the window, not at the city, but at her own reflection in the tinted glass. The woman staring back was a stranger on the verge of becoming herself. Arthur, the driver, was silent and impeccable, navigating the bustling Manhattan streets with an ease that spoke of years of experience. When they pulled up to the discreet side entrance of the Carlyle, a doorman, who looked like he had been there since the Roosevelt administration, stepped forward and opened her door. "Welcome back, Ms. Sterling," he said with a small, respectful bow. He hadn't seen her in 10 years, but he recognized her instantly. Loyalty, like quality, was timeless. Julian was waiting for her in the private elevator. He was a man of indeterminate age, with silvering hair at his temples and eyes that saw everything. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored Savile Row suit, the picture of understated power. "Ella," he said, his expression a mixture of solemnity and fierce pride. "Your father would be so proud. He would be furious that I let it go on this long," she replied, a wry smile touching her lips. "He would be furious at Vance," Julian corrected, "but he would admire your patience. A lioness does not roar at every annoyance. She waits for the moment to strike." The elevator opened directly into the Sterling suite. The air smelled of old leather wood smoke and a faint hint of freesia, her mother's favorite flower. It was as if time had stood still. In the mahogany-paneled library, 3 figures rose as she entered. There was Wei Chen, a technological visionary from Shanghai, whose company Vance Industries desperately needed as a partner for their Asian expansion. He was a small, immaculate man with a mind like a steel trap. Her father had been his mentor. Next to him stood Isabelle Dubois, the CEO of a French luxury conglomerate, a woman of impossibly chic style and ruthless business acumen. Her family and the Sterlings had been allies for generations. And finally, there was Lord Harrington, a British peer with a booming laugh and an influence that ran deep in the veins of international finance. He was her godfather. "Ellie, my girl," Lord Harrington boomed, enveloping her in a hug that smelled of expensive cologne and cigars. "It's about bloody time." Isabelle air-kissed her on both cheeks. "Ma chérie," she murmured, her sharp eyes scanning Ella's simple attire. "We have much work to do, but the foundation is magnificent." Mr. Chen simply bowed his head. "Miss Sterling, it is an honor. My family owes yours a debt we can never fully repay. Tonight, we begin to try." For the next 2 hours, the Sterling suite was transformed into a war room and a high-fashion atelier. While Julian briefed Ella on the final details of their plan, the exact timing of their arrival, the key financial data she needed to have at her fingertips, the motion she would introduce at the impromptu board meeting, a hand-picked team that Isabelle had summoned descended upon her. A legendary hairstylist named Antoine, who had been flown in from Paris, studied her hair. Non, this ponytail is a tragedy," he declared, his scissors already snipping. "We need to release the lioness." A makeup artist, a young prodigy named Sophia, laid out her tools like a surgeon. "The eyes," she whispered mostly to herself. "The eyes have a story to tell. We will make them read it from across the room." They worked with an intense, focused energy. Her mousy ponytail was transformed into a cascade of soft dark waves that framed her face and highlighted her high cheekbones. Sophia's makeup was a masterpiece of subtlety and drama. She didn't mask Ella's features, she amplified them. A smoky eye gave her gaze a new depth and intensity, while a bold crimson lipstick made her mouth look both powerful and sensual. Finally, there was the dress. It was not a dress, it was a statement of intent. Isabel had it brought in from her own label's archives. It was a custom-made gown of deep emerald green silk that seemed to drink the light. It was cut in a deceptively simple sheath that clung to her figure, a figure that, freed from years of drab, shapeless clothing, was revealed to be slender and graceful. The dress was strapless, showcasing her elegant shoulders, and a single breathtaking piece of jewelry was placed around her neck, the sterling diamond. It was a necklace of legendary status, a waterfall of perfectly cut, flawless diamonds cascading from a central stone the size of a robin's egg. It hadn't been seen in public for over 20 years. Wearing it was not an act of vanity. It was a declaration of war. It was the equivalent of a monarch wearing their crown jewels into battle. When the transformation was complete, Ella stood before a three-way mirror. The woman who stared back was someone she recognized from a long-forgotten dream. She was no longer Ella Vance, the plain, apologetic wife. She was Ella Sterling, daughter of Augustus' heiress to an empire, and a woman who had finally had enough. She stood taller, her posture imbued with a confidence that came from deep within. Lord Harrington let out a low whistle. "Good heavens, Ellie, you look formidable." Mr. Chen nodded in agreement. "You are no longer the shadow, you are the light." Julian handed her a slim, diamond-encrusted clutch. "It's time," he said softly. "Richard's keynote speech starts in 15 minutes. We'll arrive just as he's reaching his crescendo." Ella took one last look in the mirror. She saw her father's strength in her jawline, her mother's grace in her posture, and a fire in her eyes that was all her own. The rage she had felt earlier had been honed into a sharp, diamond-hard resolve. Richard had wanted a supernova on his arm. He was about to get a celestial event of cataclysmic proportions. "Let's not keep them waiting," she said, her voice as cool and brilliant as the diamonds around her neck. "I believe my husband is about to give the speech of his life. It seems only fair that I should be there for the grand finale." The Great Hall of the Metropolitan Museum of Art was a symphony of power and excess. Towering floral arrangements composed of exotic white orchids and deep crimson roses reached towards the vaulted ceilings like offerings to the gods of capital. The air hummed with the murmur of 1,000 conversations, the clinking of crystal champagne flutes, and the subtle, continuous flash of cameras. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved like ghosts through the glittering throng, their silver trays laden with champagne and caviar-topped blinis. This was Richard Vance's cathedral, and tonight he was its high priest. He stood near the base of the grand staircase, a triumphant smile plastered on his face. He was in his element, a shark in a sea of well-dressed minnows. His hand was being shaken. His back slapped his name, being whispered with the reverence usually reserved for royalty. Sheikh Al-Fahim, a man whose personal wealth could buy small countries, had just clapped him on the shoulder, calling him a true visionary. Richard's ego, already a formidable entity, swelled to near-bursting capacity. An incredible evening, Richard, truly incredible, gushed a junior board member, a man named Henderson, whose primary skill was sycophancy. "We aim to impress Henderson," Richard replied, his gaze sweeping the room, cataloguing the influential faces, the political figures, the financial titans. He felt a surge of pure, unadulterated power. This was his world. He had built this. Everything was perfect. Almost. He had arrived with Clarissa on his arm, as planned. She was wearing a blood-red backless dress that was both expensive and obvious. She played her part well, laughing at the right jokes, her hand resting possessively on his forearm. But several of the older, more established guests had given her a dismissive glance. She was a temporary amusement, and they all knew it. She was not a first lady, she was a footnote. It was a minor annoyance, a tiny crack in the flawless facade, but it pricked at him. His keynote speech was scheduled for 9:30 p.m. It was a speech about the future, about a bold new 10-year plan for global expansion he called Project Chimera. It was ambitious, aggressive, and hinged entirely on securing the partnership with Wei Chen's company and the financial backing of investors like Sheikh Al-Fahim. At 9:25 p.m., Richard took his place at the podium on the stage, which had been erected in front of the Temple of Dendur. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the crowd. A single spotlight illuminated him. He looked out at the sea of faces, a king surveying his loyal subjects. Friends, colleagues, visionaries, he began, his voice deep and resonant, filling the vast space. A decade ago, Vance Industries was a dream, sketched on a napkin. Tonight, that dream stands as a titan of global industry. He spoke with practiced charisma, weaving a narrative of relentless innovation and bold leadership. He was the hero of the story, the lone genius who had bent the world to his will. The crowd was captivated, hanging on his every word. "But I am not a man who rests on his laurels," he declared, his voice rising with theatrical passion. "The past is merely a prologue. Today we stand on the precipice of a new era, an era of unparalleled growth and audacious ambition. I call it Project Chimera." A dramatic chord of music swelled from the hidden speakers. The crowd erupted in applause. Richard paused, letting the moment land, a master showman milking the adoration. It was at that precise moment that the grand bronze doors to the great hall swung open. It wasn't a loud entrance, but it had the effect of a sonic boom. All heads, which had been directed at the stage, turned as one towards the sudden flood of light from the entrance foyer. 4 figures stood silhouetted against the light. As they stepped forward into the hall, a wave of whispers rippled through the room, quickly building into a shocked murmur. Leading the procession was a woman. She was a vision in emerald green, the silk of her gown shimmering under the chandeliers. A river of diamonds cascaded around her neck, so brilliant they seemed to pull all the light in the room towards them. Her dark hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and her eyes, smoky and intense, swept across the hall with an unnerving calm. There was an aura of power around her, so potent, it was almost a physical force. The initial shock of the room was at her beauty and presence. The second, much larger shock came as people began to recognize her. It was a slow, dawning realization, like a photograph coming into focus. The face was familiar, but the context, the confidence, the sheer breathtaking power, it was all wrong. It was Ella Vance. But she was not alone. To her right was Lord Harrington, his arm linked gallantly with hers. To her left was Isabelle Dubois, looking like she had stepped out of the pages of Vogue Paris. And just behind them, his face, a mask of quiet deference, was Wei Chen. It was a grouping that made no sense. The British financier, the French luxury queen, and the Chinese tech mogul, 3 of the most powerful and reclusive figures in their respective fields, were not just attending the gala. They had arrived together as an entourage, and they were acting as an honor guard for a woman no one had ever paid attention to. On the stage, Richard froze. The smile on his face faltered, then dissolved completely, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure disbelief. It was as if he was seeing a ghost wearing a king's ransom in diamonds. He couldn't process the image before him. This was not his plain mousy wife. This was a goddess, a warrior queen. What was she doing here? And how in God's name was she with them? The crowd parted before Ella and her companions as if by divine command. They moved with an unhurried grace, their destination clear. They weren't heading for a table. They were walking directly towards the stage. Sheikh Al-Fahim, who had been standing near the front, saw them approaching. His eyes widened first at Ella, then at the sterling diamond necklace. He was a man who knew jewels, and he knew that necklace was priceless, a piece of history. He then looked at Lord Harrington and Mr. Chen, two men he had been trying to get a meeting with for over a year. He immediately abandoned his conversation and moved to intercept them, his hand outstretched. Lord Harrington paused, gave the sheik a polite but cool nod, and said, "Not now, Fahim. We are here on official business." He then turned his full attention back to Ella, leaving the billionaire sheikh standing there stunned and ignored. The message was clear and brutal. Whatever power the sheikh thought he had in this room, it was nothing compared to the woman in the green dress. The whispers in the hall had now grown into a roar of confused speculation. Clarissa, who had been watching Richard's speech with rapt attention, now looked from the stage to the approaching group, her face pale with confusion and a dawning sense of dread. Ella stopped at the foot of the stage, her gaze locking with Richard's. For a moment, the entire vast hall seemed to shrink until it contained only the two of them. She held his gaze, her expression unreadable, but for the faint, cold fire in her eyes. There was no trace of the timid woman who had pleaded with him just a few hours ago. He was looking at a complete stranger. Lord Harrington stepped forward. His voice, accustomed to commanding the House of Lords, boomed through the hall, easily overriding the confused din. "Richard," he said, his tone deceptively pleasant. "Apologies for the interruption. We seem to have a matter of some urgency to discuss. A board matter." Richard was speechless. He opened and closed his mouth, but no sound came out. The teleprompter still displayed the triumphant conclusion to his speech, but the words were meaningless now. "I'm afraid my husband is in the middle of a keynote address," Ella said, her voice clear and steady, amplified by the hall's perfect acoustics. It was the first time she had spoken, and the sound of it, so calm, so confident, sent another shockwave through the crowd. "Yes, well, plans change," Isabelle Dubois added, a chic, deadly smile playing on her lips. She looked up at Richard, her gaze as sharp as a stiletto. "Mr. Vance, we, the undersigned, majority shareholders of Vance Industries, are calling an emergency meeting of the board, effective immediately." She held up a slim, leather-bound folder. The meaning was unmistakable. This wasn't a social visit. This was a coup. And the woman Richard had called a shadow, the flaw he had banned from his perfect night, was standing at the very heart of it, shining with the force of 1,000 suns. The gala wasn't his coronation anymore. It was his tribunal. The Temple of Dendur, usually a silent witness to millennia, was now the backdrop for a corporate execution. The gala guests, a mesmerized and baffled audience, were asked by a suddenly officious hotel staff to move back, creating a wide, cleared space around the stage. The party was over. The real drama had just begun. Richard, looking pale and disoriented, was escorted by Julian Rowe, who had appeared as if from thin air to a large round table that had been swiftly set up at the foot of the stage. He sank into a chair, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and denial. He looked at Ella, who sat directly opposite him, her expression serene, her hands resting calmly on the table. The sterling diamond on her neck seemed to pulse with a cold, white light. Lord Harrington, Isabel Dubois, and Wei Chen took their seats beside her. They were joined by two other senior board members who had been in the audience, their faces grim. They had been summoned by text message and had come forward like men walking to the gallows. They knew which way the wind was blowing. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard finally managed his voice, a hoarse croak. He looked at Lord Harrington. "Charles, what is going on? Is this some kind of joke? I assure you, Richard, I am not known for my sense of humor in matters of finance," Lord Harrington said dryly. He nodded towards the leather folder in front of Isabel. "As Ms. Dubois stated, we are here as a consortium of majority shareholders." Richard scoffed, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. "Majority? That's impossible. I hold 40% of the voting stock. That's more than anyone. The rest is scattered among institutional investors and the board," was Mr. Chen corrected softly. His English was perfect, each word precise. The operative word is "was." As of this morning, a controlling interest in Vance Industries, 51% to be exact, was consolidated under a single holding entity. Richard's blood ran cold. A hostile takeover. He had firewalls, poison pills, every defense mechanism imaginable. How could this have happened without him knowing what entity who he demanded, his eyes darting between the impassive faces around the table? Isabel Dubois smiled that lethal smile again. "An entity I believe you are familiar with, at least in name. It's called the Sterling Legacy Trust." The name hit Richard like a physical blow. Sterling. He knew the name, of course. It was a ghost, a legend in the financial world. Augustus Sterling had been a leviathan of industry, a man who built empires before Richard had even learned to tie his own shoes. But he had died a decade ago, and his vast fortune was rumored to have been locked away in an impenetrable trust managed by a shadowy cabal of old-world loyalists. That's ancient history," Richard stammered. "The trust hasn't made a move in 10 years. The trust has been waiting," Ella said, speaking for the first time. Her voice cut through the tension like a scalpel. "It has been waiting for the right moment, for the right cause." Richard stared at her, a horrifying, impossible thought beginning to form in the deepest recesses of his mind. The way they deferred to her, the sterling diamond around her neck, her maiden name, the one he had forced her to discard and forget. Sterling. "No," he whispered, shaking his head in denial. "It can't be." "Oh, but it can be," Richard, Lord Harrington said, his voice laced with pity. "You see, what you and the rest of the world never knew was that the great Augustus Sterling had one heir, a daughter. He worried she would be pursued for her fortune, not for herself. So he went to great lengths to give her a private life, a chance at normalcy. He created a new identity for her, scrubbed her from the public record. He gave her a new surname, one he picked from a book, a simple common name. He named her Ella Vance. The silence that followed was absolute. The truth, so immense and so devastating, settled over Richard, suffocating him. His wife, his plain, boring, insignificant wife, was not just some librarian he had picked up. She was Ella Sterling, the sole inheritor of one of the largest private fortunes on the planet. He felt a wave of nausea. He thought back over the last 10 years, the condescending remarks, the casual cruelty, the constant belittling, banning her from the gala because she was too plain. He hadn't just insulted his wife. He had insulted the woman who owned his company. But why, he choked out, his voice cracking, "Why marry me?" Ella's calm finally broke, but not into tears. Her expression hardened and the fire in her eyes blazed. "Because I was a fool," she said, her voice low and laced with a decade of repressed fury. "Because I was young and naive, and I believed your lies. I believed you saw something in me, not in what I might have. I wanted to be loved for who I was, not what I was worth. I told my father I had found an honorable man. An ambitious man, yes, but a good man." She laughed, a bitter, heartbreaking sound. "My father knew better. He saw the rot in you from the very beginning. But he let me make my own choice. With one condition. He set up the trust not just to protect the estate, but to protect his legacy and me. Julian Lord Harrington, Ms. Dubois, Mr. Chen. They are not just board members, Richard. They are the trustees, my protectors." Julian Rowe stepped forward from the shadows and placed a hand on Ella's shoulder. Richard's mind reeled. He remembered a crisis 7 years ago, a hostile bid from a competitor that had nearly sunk him. The financing to fight it off had appeared at the last minute from a mysterious, anonymous benefactor in Switzerland. He had always assumed it was a savvy investor who saw potential. "That was you," he breathed, looking at Ella. "The buyout attempt? The Swiss fund?" "It was the trust," Mr. Chen confirmed. "We saved your company. My price for joining the board and bringing my technology to the table was not a partnership with you. It was a seat at the table to watch over Ella. My family has been allied with the Sterlings since before the war," Isabel added. "My seat on the board was my grandmother's dying wish, to ensure Augustus's daughter was safe. It was all clicking into place. Each piece of the puzzle, a new nail in his coffin. His entire success, the empire he so proudly claimed to have built himself, was a lie. He hadn't been a king. He had been a court jester allowed to play with the crown as long as he kept the real queen happy. And he had failed spectacularly. "So this is it," he said, a desperate, wild look in his eyes. "Revenge. You humiliate me publicly, you take my company, all because I didn't take you to a party." Ella leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "A party," she hissed, her voice dangerously quiet. "You think this is about a party? This isn't about one night, Richard. It's about 10 years. It's about every time you made me feel small so you could feel big. It's about every time you dismissed my thoughts, my feelings, my very existence. You didn't just ban me from a gala. You banned me from our life. You kept me in a beautiful prison and called it a marriage." She stood up, her full height, commanding the attention of everyone present. The anemic stock performance over the last 2 quarters, the disastrous foray into South American markets that you covered up, the Project Chimera you just announced, which is nothing but a high-risk gamble to stroke your own ego. The trust has been watching, and we are no longer satisfied with your leadership. She looked at the assembled board members. "I, Ella Sterling, as the representative of the majority shareholder, the Sterling Legacy Trust, do hereby call a vote of no confidence in the chairman and CEO, Richard Vance." Lord Harrington's voice boomed. "I second the motion." "All in favor?" Ella asked, her gaze sweeping the table. One by one, the hands went up. Lord Harrington, Isabel Dubois, Wei Chen. The two other board members, their faces ashen, slowly raised theirs as well. It was unanimous. Richard stared at the raised hands, the symbols of his utter and complete ruin. He had been dethroned. He had been annihilated. He looked at Ella, truly seeing her for the first time. The strength, the intelligence, the power. It had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, and he had been too arrogant, too blind to see it. She had not shown up with the board of directors. She was the board of directors. The motion carries Ella announced, her voice ringing with the finality of a judge's gavel. Richard Vance is hereby removed from all positions at Vance Industries, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises. She looked at him one last time, not with hatred, but with a kind of weary finality. The war was over. "You called me a shadow, Richard," she said softly. "You were wrong. I was an eclipse, and you were just standing in the way of the sun." The aftermath of the gala was not a quiet implosion. It was a media supernova. By sunrise, the story was on the front page of every major financial publication, from the Wall Street Journal to the Financial Times. Vance, ousted in shocking gala coup, screamed one headline. "The secret heiress, who is Ella Sterling, asked another." The narrative was irresistible. The scorned wife, the secret billionaire, the public takedown. Richard Vance went from being a captain of industry to a cautionary tale in the span of 6 hours. He wasn't just escorted from the Met, he was escorted from his life. When he finally arrived back at the penthouse in a taxi, humiliated and broken, his keycard was denied. A stoic security guard, one of Julian's men, informed him that Ms. Sterling had requested he retrieve his personal effects by appointment only. The penthouse, the art, the life he had curated with such narcissistic precision, it was all hers. It had always been hers. He spent the next few days in a haze of disbelief and impotent rage, holed up in a suite at a hotel he once would have considered beneath him. His calls went unanswered. His allies, the ones he thought were his friends, distanced themselves from him as if he were radioactive. Clarissa, his ambitious assistant, had her corporate accounts frozen and was unceremoniously fired for cause a litany of her complicity in Richard's financial cover-ups suddenly brought to light by Julian's team. She disappeared from the scene, her 15 minutes of infamy having expired. The true reckoning, however, came a week later. Richard was summoned to the law offices of Sullivan and Cromwell, a firm so powerful its name was spoken in whispers. He had expected to meet with divorce lawyers to haggle over what scraps he might be thrown. He was unprepared for who was waiting for him in the vast, wood-paneled boardroom. Ella was there, seated at the head of the table. She was not in a gown and diamonds, but in a sharply tailored business suit of dark grey wool that radiated authority. She looked powerful, focused, and completely in her element. Julian stood behind her, and flanking her were a team of the most ruthless lawyers in New York. "Richard, thank you for coming," she said, her tone cool and professional. There was no emotion in it, no lingering anger. This was not a domestic dispute. It was a corporate dissolution. A lawyer slid a thick document across the polished table towards him. "This is your severance and divorce settlement," the lawyer stated flatly. Richard's hands trembled as he opened the folder. He had been preparing for a fight, ready to argue that his genius had grown the company, that he was entitled to half of everything accumulated during their marriage. The settlement laid out was clinical and brutal. He was to receive a one-time payment of $10 million. In his world, it was a pittance barely enough to maintain a semblance of his former lifestyle for a few years. All shares, properties, and assets acquired during the marriage were traced back to the Sterling Trust and were therefore declared non-marital property. The pre-nuptial agreement he had forced a young Ella to sign, an ironclad document designed to protect his future earnings from her, was invoked, but in reverse, protecting her vast ancestral wealth from him. The irony was so thick, it was almost suffocating. 10 million, he choked, looking up at her, his face a mask of outrage. After 10 years of my life, I built that company. Ella looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something beyond business. It was pity. No, Richard, you didn't build it, you managed it. And lately, you've managed it poorly. The trust saved the company from your mistakes multiple times. This settlement is not a punishment. It's a severance package. And frankly, considering your performance over the last year, it's a generous one. She stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. There is one other thing. The SEC has opened an inquiry into the South American market irregularities. My lawyers have advised the trust to cooperate fully. We are providing them with all relevant documents. The final blow landed. He was not just broke. He was facing federal investigation. The cover-ups, the numbers he'd fudged to make himself look good, it was all coming out. She wasn't just divorcing him. She was erasing him. Ella, please, he begged, the last of his pride shattering. He was a man with nothing left to lose. Don't do this. I'm sorry for everything. I was a fool. I was blind. I loved you. The last two words fell into the silent room with a thud. Ella paused at the door, her back to him. No, Richard, she said, without turning around. You never loved me. You loved the idea of me, the quiet, uncomplicated woman who made you feel powerful. You loved that I was a blank canvas you could paint your own masterpiece over. The moment I picked up my own brush, you hated me for it. She turned slightly, looking at him over her shoulder. The real tragedy is that I think for a while I really did love you. But you starved that love to death. You can't neglect something and expect it to survive. She walked out of the room without another word, leaving him alone with his ruin. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change. Vance Industries was officially rebranded as Sterling Vance Global, a nod to the past and a clear signal for the future. Ella, taking the helm as chairwoman, proved to be a revelation. The quiet observer had been watching and learning for a decade. She had her father's strategic mind and a modern, more ethical approach to business. She axed the reckless Project Chimera, initiated partnerships with green technology firms, and implemented sweeping changes to corporate culture, emphasizing transparency and employee welfare. The market, once spooked, responded with soaring confidence. Wei Chen's partnership was solidified. Isabelle Dubois' luxury group announced a joint venture, and Lord Harrington secured a new line of credit on terms Richard could only have dreamed of. Ella sold the cold, minimalist penthouse and moved back into the sterling suite at the Carlisle, transforming it from a memorial into a vibrant home and headquarters. She was seen not at galas, but at site visits, at tech incubators, and at the soup kitchen in the Bronx, where she was now the primary benefactor. She was building a new legacy, one that honored her father's name, but was forged in her own fire. She had learned the hard way that her worth was not determined by a man's approval. She was not a reflection in someone else's mirror, but the source of the light itself. Her story became a legend in the city, a tale of justice, of empowerment, of a woman who refused to remain a footnote in her own life. She was no longer Richard Vance's plain wife. She was Ella Sterling, and she was just getting started. And so Ella Sterling traded her gilded cage for a throne of her own making. This wasn't just a story of revenge, it was a story of reclamation. It's a powerful reminder that the people we underestimate often possess the most strength, and that true power isn't about the noise you make, but the impact you have. Ella's journey from a dismissed shadow to a commanding force shows us that our value is inherent and not defined by anyone else's opinion. What did you think of Ella's incredible transformation? Let us know in the comments below. If you were moved by her story and want more tales of dramatic justice and empowerment, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable real-life dramas.